Hey all, it's week 11. I'm a little under the weather this week, but I didn't want you to not have a video from me, even though I know not everybody watches them. I do know the folks that do watch it appreciate it. So I might be a little less energetic this week, a little less crazy, gesticulating craziness, but I'm going to do the best I can. So it's week 11, and we're talking about economics, and we're looking at sort of two different aspects of that. One is, how do people actually make a living, right? How do they get the resources that they need to survive? And then another one is sort of how they exchange resources, right? So, how they kind of move them around amongst people and between groups. So, we're going to start with the four different modes of subsistence that human beings use. The first of these is foraging. And foraging is the only one of the methods of subsistence that doesn't include food production. In this method, people are hunting and gathering for what's already available in the environment. In fact, you might have heard of these types of folks referred to as hunters and gatherers. We don't use that terminology so much in anthropology. Partially because people have a whole set of assumptions about what that means, but also because it tends to prioritize hunting over gathering, even though gathering is the method by which most folks got most of their calories, most of their subsistence. So when we look at foraging peoples, we're talking about small groups, bands of people who are moving around a certain part of their environment and gathering the food that is available. So they're nomadic, right? They don't have one settled place that they live. They're relatively egalitarian. This means that there's not a lot of status differences between people. Pretty much anybody can do any of the tasks necessary for the group to survive. And they have a relatively informal political system. We do find that most foraging groups tend to work less than all of the groups that actually produce their own food, an average of between 4 and 6 hours a day. Now, when we look at slightly more complex foraging groups, we see these complex foraging groups mostly in fishing communities. So they are more settled, even though they're still getting most of what they need to live on from the ocean or a lake or river. Since they're more settled in one place, they tend to have a more complex society and more social inequality between groups. So not as egalitarian as the simple foragers we spoke of first. Okay, so we're going to see three different kinds of food production. You remember, foraging folks are the people who don't produce their own food. Everybody else from here on in does. Now, food production, you'll remember from our earlier conversations, started about 10,000 years ago and sort of arose in the Fertile Crescent and in parts of South America. And we talked about this a few weeks ago. And we're going to have three different kinds of food production societies. The first of these is horticulture. And you could think of horticulture as very simple farming, more like gardening, really, okay? Where groups are tending to build a garden or a small and temporary farm, but they move it when that soil is exhausted, which means that their settlements are also a little more transitory. They tend to move along with the gardens. In horticultural societies, some of them are swidden farmers. This means they practice slash and burn agriculture. So they cut down everything in an area and burn it, and then the ash tends to fertilize it, and then they use that to plant in until that soil is exhausted, and then they build another garden next to that. Okay, the third of these we're going to talk about is pastoralists. Pastoralists are making their living by herding animals, right? Not necessarily the same as we think of farming, but more sort of less settled, often in desert areas, folks who follow the herds of animals. Sometimes these folks are what we call transhumans practicing, which means they have a village where the old people and the very young are, but the rest of the adults and most of the males are following the herds to new areas to graze seasonally. That's pastoralism. And then the last of these is the one that we ourselves practice, and that's intensive agriculture. With this, we're seeing very settled patterns of living, high input farming. That means we're using fertilizer and irrigation, and since you're not moving your fields each time the soil is depleted, you have to do things to add to the soil to make that keep going. In these societies, we're going to see the first real development of surplus, which means if we have surplus, we also have status differences. Some folks are going to have more than other folks, so we're moving away, far away from the egalitarian political system we saw with foraging groups. Also, when you get up here in intensive agriculture, you're more likely to see forced labor through either sort of direct forced labor or slavery, but also through taxes, where people don't have a choice about whether they get to work for the government. Okay, so why do you think most of the world turned to food production when foraging is, in general, sounds like kind of a better way of life? It would be nice to work only 4 hours a day to have everything you need. There's a couple of different reasons that anthropologists have suggested for this. One is that at the point that agriculture developed, we had a much bigger population. And because we had a bigger population, that means that all of the habitable areas of the world were becoming filled. Part of this is probably due to climate change, which pushed people into areas in which there was already a lot of wild grasses growing. Okay, so we talked about this development of agriculture a bit already, and I'm not going to go into it any further now. Okay, so how do each of these groups allocate the resources once they gather them in, right? So if we look at our foraging groups, our bands, we're going to see that they organize the distribution of resources based on kinship. Small bands, they don't own the land that they live on or the animals or plants that they work from, so everybody shares what is available. And when we look at a horticultural society, they also don't own the land, so they tend to look at the available amount of land and divide it up amongst the people so that everybody has some land in the community to work on. If we look at our pastoralists, we can see that they also tend to not own their land, right? They own their herds of grazing animals, but they graze them communally on property that is not owned by individuals. But when we get into intensive agriculture and, of course, our own society, we're going to see that it is very dependent on private ownership. Now, of course, most of the world was pastoralist, horticultural, or foraging before the colonial period, except for, Europe, basically, right? But colonialism went in and took the land away from all the indigenous folks. Didn't really matter what form of allocating resources they used, because under colonialism, they were forced to follow a more state-level private ownership model that gave all that land to the folks who were colonizing the area. So there was a lot of conflict between groups that said the land is everybody's and we need to share, and the colonial groups coming in and saying nobody owns this land, I guess I'll take it for myself. Okay, so that's how they allocate land. Now let's look at how folks allocate resources. We're going to have 3 different ways of talking about this one. The first of these is reciprocity. In reciprocity, no money changes hands. You could think of this as more like barter, right? Where we see that, for instance, a society is relatively small. They have unpredictable resources and social relationships between all the people in the groups. That means that I know everybody in my group and they know me, which means that we are more likely to share what we have. This only really works when you have a small scale society, right? If you look at sort of the large complex society we live in, it would completely not work with our unequal status amongst the different groups to say, well, here's the deal. We just think that folks that have a lot should share with the people who don't have a lot, and that would work out. No, you need a smaller scale society, face-to-face relationships. Now, when we look at the second of these, redistribution, this is still, sort of outside of a formal market exchange. That's the third one we're going to talk about. And it requires a hierarchy. So in this type of exchange, you're going to find folks putting their surplus into a central authority, and then that central authority is going to decide who needs what from there. You could think of this a little bit like the Marxist argument that people should give according to what they have and take according to what they need. But the thing is that this system requires a hierarchy. Now, I've asked you about this in our discussion this week, so I don't want to 100% give away the ball. But I do want to say that we, of course, have this method of exchange in our society as well. If you think about your taxes, right? Certain amount of your money, of your goods, goes into a central authority, and then the central authority does things with that are supposed to be good for the community as a whole. And then the third of these is, of course, market exchange. This is buying and selling. Requires more social distance between people, right? So not the same face-to-face, I trust you, you trust me sort of relationship. A price is set in a market, and then people either choose to or don't choose to pay that. This is a relatively new, if you look at the grand scale of human existence, a relatively new way of exchanging goods and services with one another. However, we find that market exchange is pretty much spread all over the world now, and it even is in places that have those small band foraging societies, right? So it overarches them. We find when we add money, when we add a market exchange into a society, even if there's another method of exchange there, we see less sharing, less communal distribution of goods, more commercialization of resources that are available, and much more class polarization. So not a super upper to end on, but we made it through the video. Let's hope that this uploads to YouTube, which has been giving me fits lately. And I will look forward to having much more discussion about all of this with you all in the forums this week. See ya.